Good evening and welcome to the Wayland Library. Before we begin tonight's program, we want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples on whose traditional homelands we live, work, and gather tonight. The Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Wampanoag, and the Pawtucket. We acknowledge their ancestors, particularly Carto of the Massachusetts tribe, who was a steward of much of the land now encompassing Sudbury and Wayland when European settlers arrived to colonize this place in 1638. We seek to understand, acknowledge, and remember the painful ongoing history of war, genocide, and forced removal of Indigenous peoples by European settlers. And we offer a living celebration of the Indigenous communities who are not just part of the past, but who continue to live and make new history here today. May we all commit to deepening our relationships with Indigenous communities and to being their allies in working for justice. And toward that end, we are honored to have Curator Rhonda Anderson and photographer Sara Lyons here with us to discuss their exhibit, Vital.Vibrant.Visible, Local Indigenous Identity Through Portraiture, which is on view at the library through November 27th. Rhonda Anderson is Iñupiaq-Athabascan from Alaska. Her native enrollment village is Iñupiaq. I hope I said that correctly. Her life work, most importantly, is as a mother, as well as a classically trained herbalist, silversmith, educator, and activist. Her activism ranges from removal of mascots, water protector, Indigenous identity, and protecting her traditional homelands in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from extractive industry. Rhonda has been recognized for her work by the Massachusetts State Senate and the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women as a 2021 Commonwealth heroine. She's also the Western Massachusetts Commissioner on Indian Affairs and the founder and co-director of the Okito Cultural Center and the Native Youth Empowerment Foundation, and a member of the Advisory Council for the New England Foundation for the Arts. Sara Lyons is an artist and educator living in Western Massachusetts. She received her BFA in photography from Rochester Institute of Technology and her MAT in visual arts from the Rhode Island School of Design. In addition to her work as an art instructor at a public charter school, Sara teaches photography workshops that delve into creativity, fieldwork, and project development. Images from Sara's fine art photographic series have been exhibited throughout the East Coast. I want to thank Rhonda and Sara again for being here with us tonight. And 2 quick notes. We are recording this session for broadcast on Waycam, our local cable access channel, and for the library's YouTube page. So you will be able to watch and share with friends. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll hold them until the Q&A session after our presentations. So now that we've got that out of the way, I'll hand it over to Sara.
All right. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you to the Wayland Library for having us. And thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This looks promising. Are you seeing anything? I am not. Oh. I'm going to try that again and make a different choice. Let's try this one. How about that? Yeah, all right, awesome. Okay, and let me open this up to full screen. Okay, now still seeing the sides? Okay, great, all right. So I came to work on this project as a photographer, an artist, a community member, as well as an art educator. And it was my honor and privilege to take part in this photographic exploration and creation of these portraits. But I had to start by acknowledging that I was coming at this project as an outsider. And that photography has a long history of outsiders using cameras to consider other cultures, other societies, other groups of folks, and unfortunately, photography also has a long history of misrepresenting groups and cultures and folks when the artist or the photographer is looking from the outside in. And so I wanted to make sure that I did my work as responsibly as possible and started digging in on my knowledge of photographic history, but also just very from the very beginning, thinking in terms of the language that we use when we think about taking or making a photograph. So at its most basic, the language around photography has begun with words like shoot, capture, and take. And these are all powerful words when you're thinking of colonialism and exploitation. And so I think it's important to frame this conversation with these words and thinking about who we are, especially if we consider ourselves artists and photographers. It is of the utmost importance to me as an educator and an artist to try to create work and also to inspire the creation of work in my students where folks are considering their approach. There's always lots of ways to look at a certain subject. I am a believer in the Bethany Mollenkopf School of Photography, where photography is a license. It's an opportunity to follow some curiosity and to work with and collaborate with subjects if portraiture is your goal and your interest. How can you grow with somebody and how can you co-create something, as opposed to making the assumption that just because you have a camera, you therefore have a passport to instill and inject your perspective onto something, which I think has created some problematic work over the years. And we need to think about how we approach subjects and work to avoid exploitation and misrepresentation. So some of what I thought about and subsequently put into words, and lots of folks in a variety of photographic organizations are doing research and academic writing and education on how best to tell a story, and to ask yourself whether you are the right person to tell a story. And listening and being present and being able to ask yourself what's important to you versus what is important to your subject and your collaborator. And to really be checking your own biases and judgments and figuring out whether they're seeping into your work and into your imagery. And I think sometimes the best way to work on that is to ask for feedback from reliable sources, and to check yourself among other artists who are working in similar fields, and to try to get as much knowledge as possible, especially if you're stepping into a culture or a social group to which you are an outsider. And for this, I had a lot of background information, although it was important to me to back it up by rechecking and recontextualizing the knowledge that I thought I had and making sure that I was understanding it. Because Native Americans in our society, in what we consider North America, have a consistently long history of being misrepresented, especially in photography. Starting in the 1800s with photographs by Frank Reinhardt, different delegations that were asked to come to Washington, D.C., and then were photographed in ways that were misrepresented. And we now know that photographs and the ways in which people are presented in them can impact health and survival of the people in those photographs when they are misrepresented. Probably the most famous historical photographs are those of Edward Curtis, who was photographing what he believed to be a rapidly disappearing people His portfolio of works is famously known as The Vanishing Race. And what the goal of Rhonda's project and the goal of many of the artists that I'm going to share with you this evening is to show you that there's nothing vanishing about the Indigenous people in what we consider to be North America or the United States. In fact, they are very vital and visible if you care to look. Unfortunately, this misrepresentation of Indigenous people on our continent and other continents is still continuing to this day. On a positive note, the photographer represented on the right had a book put out in 2013 that alluded to Indigenous tribal people who he was trying to document before they passed away. Subsequently, he's published more recent books and has been alerted to some of the language around representation and has chosen to name his most recent book Homage to Humanity. So outsiders are improving, which is great. You know, these are baby steps, but we're doing what we can. The people, though, who are doing the most work and the people to whom we need to provide more platforms, we, meaning white allies, people in authority, people in positions who can uplift and raise and open doors for. And that's not to say that these folks aren't doing the work themselves, because they are. I would like to share some work of Indigenous photographers who are doing incredible things. And what's really exciting is just within the last couple of years, I continue to update this slideshow, this slide presentation every time I give it. And it's really exciting, you know, with social media, we're able to follow these photographers and follow their careers. And museums, galleries, educators, universities, and colleges are all opening their doors and realizing that we need to really pay more attention to Indigenous-led narratives, and that we have so much to learn. So Matika Wilbur is a photographer from Seattle or from Washington State, who I believe in 2012 undertook a project to photograph Indigenous folks from what was then the 562 federally recognized tribes. I believe that now we're up to 574 federally recognized tribes, but for consistency, the project remains called Project 562. Just this year, the project it's slowly starting to culminate. There has been a major gallery exhibition, I believe, in Washington State. And I was excited to see that a book is going to be published in early spring of 2023 that is going to encompass the portraits that were created over the last 20 years. Will Wilson is a photographer and curator who has been working in New Mexico, and he has been doing work that has been employing historical photographic practices. And he's been doing that in an effort to give a nod, but also to supplant Curtis's work and to really focus on Indigenous people who are in the highest echelons of their fields. And so to show them in working situations and to show award winners and CEOs and directors and managers, and then recontextualize them in a way that is most certainly not a vanishing race, but a thriving group of individuals who are parts of all of our communities. What's exciting about Will Wilson right now is he co-curated an exhibition with the director or the curator of photography from the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. And I think this is considered maybe the first major museum exploration of contemporary Indigenous photography. There are about 25 really incredible photographers whose work are being featured in this exhibition. The exhibition is going to be on view through January of 2023. And then I just read today that it's actually going to be moving to the Denver Art Museum, and hopefully it will move from there to other parts of the country, because it is really a pretty incredible cross-section of photographers, many of whom I'm speaking about, folks that I'm speaking about tonight are also included in this exhibition, including Will Wilson, Wendy Red Star, Nicholas Gallinen, all kinds of folks that it's really worth checking out. Uh-oh, I'm getting a strange beep. There we go. Okay. Josue Rivas is an excellent example of Indigenous photographer who has done incredible things since being invited by Indigenous folks at Standing Rock. There was apparently a lack of Indigenous photographers at Standing Rock, and folks by way of various networks reached out to Josue and got him to come, so that there was a photographer there who had Indigenous heritage, who could really represent what was happening there. And if you haven't seen the photographs that he created from that time, I definitely recommend taking a look at his website. And he has subsequently worked on creating networks of documentary photographers. It's called Natives Photograph, and it's an organization where you can reach out to try to find an Indigenous photographer if you are looking to get documentary work done and uplift an Indigenous narrative. Wendy Red Star, of course, who's gone into all kinds of different artistic media, but a lot of her early work was focused on photography that she made that were self-portraits, as well as this reimagining, or they're not recreations, but they are annotated versions of these photographs that were taken when a delegation of members from her tribe came to Washington, D.C. in the late 1800s. And she gives it an Indigenous context, and by labeling every single piece of the regalia that the seated subject is wearing, and gives it a whole new context as opposed to just the context of the outside viewer. But these also have very personal annotations and are worth really taking the time to read up close, because they speak to the spiritual and symbolic parts of the regalia, and why they're important to members of her family, as well as members of her greater community. And this was another photographer that I was super excited to see has photographs on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Met has a reputation for being a little slow to broaden their horizons outside the art historical canon of white male artists. And Cara Romero's work is definitely worth a look if you are unfamiliar with what she's been doing. But her portraiture and the collaborative work that she does with her subjects is really incredible, really thoughtful, sometimes humorous. And like I said, it was exciting to see her work featured in, it's not a photography exhibit at the Met, it is called Water Memories, and it is a exploration of water. And then it also has, as I understand it, I haven't seen it, but it also has a thread of Indigenous narrative about how significant water is to hunting and fishing and other parts of what am I trying to say? Other parts of the history of water and the fight for water rights. All right, so this is where I go back to the photographs that are on the wall behind Courtney and the photographs that are in the gallery at the library right now were indeed a collaboration between myself and Rhonda and with our subjects. It was always a pleasure to meet each subject, and it was incredibly important to both Rhonda and I that subjects were asked to consider where exactly they wanted to be photographed and how exactly they wanted to be photographed, and what they wanted to wear. None of that was directed by us. It was important for us to have the subject direct all of that, so that ideally there was a true collaboration. All of the post editing and processing of the images, because when we initially had the inaugural exhibit of this work, we were under an enormous time constraint. We pretty much banged out all these portraits in a little over a month, and then had a couple of weeks to get the prints and images done. And so we didn't have a ton of feedback until after the exhibit had been shown. And again, as the photographer, I am deeply connected to this particular photograph because this was a unique and different moment that came from the conversation that we had with this subject as they were sharing stories and as I was photographing. And for a documentary photographer to capture this particular expression and to have it feel natural and candid, it felt great. But it was not a portrait that resonated with the subject. He did not think it represented him well. And so we went back and we found a portrait that did feel like a better, more appropriate representation for him. And, you know, this is a situation where, given the history that I just spoke about and the history of what's going on and who I am and who I want to be as, you know, I consider myself an ally in training. I want to make sure that the photographs that are out there feel okay and feel like strong representations of who these folks are. So it was important for us to listen and to find a portrait that felt more apt, more appropriate for the subject. And that's the photograph that you see on the wall. And that is really, if there's one piece of advice I can give, is just to constantly be listening with open ears to our Indigenous community members and to give them the platform whenever possible and to get out of the way and to really just be open-minded and open-hearted. And with that, it is my pleasure and honor to pass the mic to my collaborator, curator, organizer, fierce mama and artist and director of all things, Rhonda Anderson.
Oh my goodness. Kuliana, thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate you. Oh, it's beautiful. So Pagalagipsi, Uvalami, Kunuksama, Iñupiaq Alak, Tanak Nagaga Adiga Rhonda Anderson, Pangmakpak Anu Uranga Korenami, Kaktoveg Mia Goranga, Fairbanks Mia Naya Nuranga, Shabaktunga, Western Massachusetts Commissioner on Indian Affairs, the founder and co-director of Ocotillo Cultural Center. So Kuyanak Nalagnigusi, thank you for listening. Kuyana to Wayland Library for having us. And Kuyanakpak, thank you very much, Courtney, for recording this and having us tonight. We really appreciate you. Thank you for hosting Vital, Vibrant, and Visible. So I greeted you traditionally in my Iñupiaq language. I'm also coming to you from Coleraine, Massachusetts, which is the traditional territory of Pecumtuck, Abenaki, Mohican, and Nipmuc. And the contemporary tribes today are Sokoke Abenaki in Vermont, that's a state acknowledged tribe, and Nipmuc, which is a state recognized or state acknowledged tribe here in Massachusetts. Let me see if I can share my screen. I almost hit leave. Can you believe that? All right, let's go to full screen. Ta-da! So first, I like to talk a little bit about myself. There's usually a lot of questions about Indigenous people, our cultures and communities. So I am, as I said, Iñupiaq-Athabascan from Alaska. My native enrollment village is that little red dot up at the very top of Alaska. That's Kaktovik. It's a whaling village in Area 1002 of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge on the Beaufort Sea. The Area 1002 is this very small bit here, and this green chunk is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We're the only village that is within the refuge. My Kaktovik family really depends on hunting and fishing and whaling for food. And twice a year, it seems like there's more polar bears than humans. And that's a photograph from my cousins of traditional whaling foods and the polar bears. My cousin Carla is on a polar bear patrol, so she alerts when there's polar bears that are in the village. It's just also important to understand that the government did not force us to leave our traditional villages, so we don't have reservations, rancherias, or reserves for enrollment. We have enrollment in native villages in Alaska. And we also belong to corporations, which is also kind of unusual, that oversee the many ways that the United States government was using our land through mining, drilling, and forestry. So my daughter and I are enrolled shareholders in Arctic Slope Regional Corporation and Kaktovik Iñupiaq Corporation. This is kind of fun. This is my Aka Olive, is the little one in the front row. I don't know if this will show up on the screen, but so my Aka Olive, she grew up in a clapboard house, not unlike houses that you might see here in New England, and it's not an igloo. So, but the unusual part of this was that there was 22 people that lived in this 2-room house. My grandmother was the youngest of 12, and she's sitting in her sister Nora's lap, my auntie Nora. She went to residential school but left in 2nd grade, and she was able to come home because she had a very large family to come home to that could afford to send her home. On this photograph, there's over here on the, I guess it would be the right side of your screen, maybe. There's a picture of my great grandmother Iñupiaq and her sister Alak, which is my namesake. At the bottom left is my Apajani, my grandfather. He went to Aklutna Residential Indian School. You know, I don't know if anyone, I should probably go over that. The United States government made sure that Indigenous children were shipped off to residential, boarding, and industrial schools. It was a pretty painful experience because the United States governments and Canadian governments took these children, like literally forced them from their homes and placed them in these schools. It was a government enforced policy of cultural genocide through the schools, where they removed native languages and cultures from the children. The motto was kill the Indian and save the man. You know, there was thousands and thousands of Indigenous children that never came home. I'll get into that a little bit later. But my grandfather quit school at age 16 to become a bush pilot and later a commercial pilot. There's a picture of my dad and I. My dad grew up in Fairbanks. He was born there, lived a life that most folks around here might recognize, where he is in softball and whatnot, or not softball, that would be baseball. I grew up in Plainfield, Massachusetts, which is a Western Massachusetts town. I lived here with my mom. She got divorced and came to Massachusetts when I was fairly young. I did go back to Alaska quite often to visit my dad and my aka. So I have like sort of dual residency, but I choose to live here in Massachusetts. And I'm not going to lie, like I have certain privileges here, but I still go back to Alaska in the summer to visit. And I've taken my daughter back. She's 18 and she's been 9 times. So I believe it's really imperative that my daughter also gets to know who she is, who her community is, and experience our culture and our homelands. I do like to get this out of the way as well. When we're talking about indigeneity, the most common question that I get asked is, what do I call you? Are you Native American? Are you Indian? Indigenous? And to get that out of the way, I like to paraphrase a little story from a late great comedian. He was absolutely wonderful, the author Jim Northrup. He wrote in his book, The Res Road Follies, that he in elementary school told him essentially that he was an Indian. In high school, he was taught that he was Native American. In college, he learned that he was Indigenous. It wasn't until he went back home to his community that he understood that he was Anishinaabe. So, you know, that is how we choose to identify ourselves. We like to identify ourselves through our traditional community name. So Iñupiaq. Another fun fact is that we are the only race in this country that must prove our blood quantum and our ancestry and have a certain percentage to be able to carry a blood quantum card or an enrollment card. So you may not even be able to enroll in a tribe if you have descendancy. So you need to have a certain amount of blood quantum. And so we're pedigreed just like dogs and horses in this country. I am Iñupiaq, which means a real person, not a dog or a horse. And many tribes refer to themselves as real human beings or the place in which they come from, having more of a land-based identity. You know, obviously the name Indian was a mistake and it kind of stuck. Native American is referring to the continent of Turtle Island or North America and its current government. But Native people were here long before the United States government was here. First Nations and Indigenous, well, you know, that would probably be best to use if you don't know the individual's tribal identity. But tribal identity is the most appropriate term to use. So throughout this presentation, I want to talk more about identity and why this project is essential. As Indigenous people, we make up less than 2% of the United States population. We are essentially invisible to mainstream society. You know, when was the last time you saw a movie or turned on the TV to watch a sitcom or see a commercial with a Native protagonist or character or a family just doing ordinary things like buying a car or eating Doritos? Like, I mean, I'm talking about Native individuals that are not placed in history or doing stereotypical things, just sort of everyday life. You know, it's really important to think about who has control over our identity as Indigenous people, because we're seen everywhere, right? We are seen on the sides of helmets, on cars, on bags of flour, on cigarettes, but these images are not of our making, right? So if we're in a live audience, I usually ask, can you imagine why this might happen? Right? This happens because if our story is told from one side, in a way that shows that we are gone or of the past, it makes our shared trouble history like really easier to hear. If we're gone, also the land is no longer ours as Indigenous people. But there's also this notion that you're honoring someone that once was, but you're not creating relationships with the people who are still here. When I'm talking about this kind of settler colonialism and relationality, I always like to paraphrase a quote from Tuck and Ree. And quote, "In order for the settlers to make a place their home, they must destroy and disappear the Indigenous peoples that live there. For the settlers, the Indigenous peoples are in the way, and in the destruction of Indigenous peoples, the land is recast as property and as a resource. Indigenous peoples must be erased and must be made into ghosts," end quote. So there's a nice slide of different ways that we're represented, not in our making. So I'll back up quite a bit now. Part of the problem with representation, it goes back quite a ways. How exactly does a settler lens erase Indigenous peoples? Well, let me tell you. Let me let you see through the eyes of an Indigenous person that grew up here in New England. And I want you to see that I see this educational system that upholds the myth of Thanksgiving and the myth of Plymouth Rock. And that's using a dominant colonizer lens on history. And using this colonizer lens creates a more comfortable account, but it's also doing a really great job of erasing Native narratives and our histories of thousands of years. So I want to start here because what schools teach us at an early age matters. School systems, they teach in a system that controls our identities on multiple fronts, using intentional erasure and teach of the disappearance of our existence. We live in an area here in Western Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is a very problematic state in this in this department. But we live in an area where it's just full of plaques. You can't go anywhere. Boom, it's right there in your face, commemorating colonizers and referencing natives as Indians and savages or the attackers, right? And again, going back to what I said about identity and how we like to identify ourselves, the term Indians erases our identities and lumps some of those, 567 federally recognized, very different cultures and identities and even separate races of Indigenous peoples into that one term, Indians. But these memorials are erected to honor the colonists' imperialistic nostalgia for patriotism and sacrifice and give justification for genocide. And to speak a little bit more on that, anthropologist Renato Rosaldo describes imperialistic nostalgia as a mood of nostalgia that makes racial domination appear innocent and pure. A people mourning for the passing or a transformation of what they have caused to be transformed. So this form of erasure is a painful reminder that we're not important enough to be recognized. And I always like to bring up the Mohawk Trail or Route 2 because I don't live very far from this roadway, and I know that Wayland Library is not too far from the other end of it. It's important to address because Clinton Q. Richmond named Route 2 the Mohawk Trail in 1913. He greatly exaggerated the claims that this was Mohawk traditional territory. And today we see those cultural appropriations and stereotypical caricature representations that have nothing to do with the people here, nothing to do with Mohawk people, and yet they continue to exist, informing people of what we should look like, and in a sense, giving a nod to manifest destiny and westward expansion. So seeing this debacle daily when driving through and driving by is actually a form of violence when you think about it. Because this is, again, not a representation of our making, and it's dangerous. On the Mohawk Trail, I love this. I cannot think of a more culturally appropriated cluster of misinformation that fully participates in erasure. And the Massachusetts DOT highlights on every scenic highway signpost for 100 miles, which is the Hail to the Sunrise statue. The Improved Order of Redmen installed this fountain and statue. And Improved Order of Redmen, you ask, what is that? The Improved Order was a group that only accepted white people, gave them Indian names, and they belonged to these clubs or orders that were called by tribal names. Those are the words on the reflection pool in front of the statue. They are not actual tribal native nations, not actual native people that are in support of the landmark. That is white people culturally appropriating. So this is another example of being seen everywhere, but still literally being invisible. And, you know, at the bottom of this slide, the prevailing mainstream attitude is cemented, to coin a phrase, is that we are gone, as this monument is in memory of the Mohawk, and as the review noted, wiped off the continent. So where did he learn that? Where did this Conrad learn this? He was taught in this country's school system's approach to controlling our identity. He was taught a form of erasure. And this type of education of disappearance, that's what it is, an education of disappearance and erasure, begins early in schools with institutional racism. Coleraine Central School and other elementary schools in the district near my home used these books in 2012. These books are classified as nonfiction, and they were introduced to my daughter's 3rd grade class. It's also really important to understand that subjectivity to a 3rd grader, it's really hard for them to suss out between fiction versus nonfiction and the subjectivity for the very first time. So in this book, The Courage of Sarah Noble, they read, and this is, again, nonfiction, they read that Indians eat human meat off the bone, would just as soon skin you alive, and the author likened Indians to little brown mice. And as you see on this slide, the vocabulary words for the book were heathen, squaw, savage, Indian, moccasin, and then the test came home with the sentence, Indians are savages. That came home because my daughter asked for a sample sentence from the teacher for the word savage. And the teacher replied, Indians are savages. And so if you notice on this test, she had to erase and capitalize Indians. It was checked, well done. There it is up here, capitalize Indians. Great, good job capitalizing the word Indian, but well done. What happened after this curriculum was put through this school? My daughter's friends sat at our dinner table. They were saying that my daughter was not native because she wasn't a heathen savage that ate human meat off the bone. So this book had devastating and long-lasting effects. You know, there's plenty of really good, exceptional Native American authors for every grade level. And yet these were the books that were chosen, written by white people, or worse, as the education of Little Tree is far, far worse. But in elementary school, participation in institutional racism education, right, with that kind of stereotyping and that kind of biases is furthered with mascots and team names in high schools. I am a longtime activist on removing mascots. I participated from afar in the late 1990s, changing Frontier high school mascot and team name. They had our skins. That was lovely. And they chose the name Red Hawks, which is lovely. And in September of 2016, I was very active in the change of Turners Falls High School Indians. And we saw the vote for change, I'll never forget, happened February 14th of 2017. And that was after a long, challenging, and very divisive battle. In March of 2019, I began the work on Mohawk Trail Regional High School team name Warriors and their mural, which is noted here in the slide. The school committee voted under duress from the pro-mascot individuals to keep the team name, but they did vote to remove the problematic mural from the gymnasium wall. I'm really hoping that it's been 3 years now. I'm really hoping that they recognize that they have more work to do. But both Turners Falls and Mohawk were high schools that I had attended. My daughter does not go to the high school in our district, which is Mohawk, because I don't want her to have the same issues with mascots that I did. So instead, she goes to, she graduated, my gosh, she went to a local charter public school. And so we proudly cheered on friends and family as aardvarks and otters, because she also was accepted into a private school, and they are the aardvarks. So these stereotypical representations and mascots really erase the identity of Native people. They generate those kind of stereotypes, like I said before, about what a Native person looks like, portraying us as people in the past. But there's empirical evidence that goes back decades that show that these representations lead to Native students struggling with a positive identity, right? They don't, how can you have a positive identity when you have this in your face? Through the use of mascots, non-Native students are left with those stereotypes about who we are. So in noting that cartoon, really, you don't look like an Indian. What is informing that non-Native student about what an Indian looks like? And then how do you think that student feels? Unsafe is how, I would not feel safe to be going to, and I didn't feel safe going to a football game, because the stereotyping makes Native students feel unsafe and unwelcome in games and school events. That's actually a civil rights violation. And civil rights should never, ever be up for a popular vote or community vote. The use of these mascots in educational settings greenlights more widespread community stereotyping. It makes it more acceptable and okay to do. And especially since most portrayals of Native mascots are warlike and aggressive and violent, as evidenced by our local newspaper headlines, which read "Indians invade" and "Town braces for Indian attack." And of course, during the battle to get rid of the Indians mascot, Turners Falls High School Thanksgiving Day game showed up with their mascot wearing a really colorful headdress. And that is outright cultural appropriation by wearing these headdresses to the games. Honestly, we are the last accepted vestige of overt racism in this country. And I'd go so far as to even say celebrated racism and cultural appropriation. Mainstream society views Native people as ignorant drunks or savage warriors or over-sexualized Pocahontas. Ultimately, this is what this kind of representation boils down to, and it's dangerous. It leads to what most people think versus the truth. This romanticized Disney-esque princess versus the real struggles and violence that we face as Indigenous peoples upholding our tribal sovereignties and Indigenous rights. This is very important because, for example, Indigenous infant mortality is 2 times the national average. 2.7 times more likely to die before the age of 1. Teen suicide among ages of 10 to 24 years old is the top cause of death. Native youth suicide is 5 times the national average, and that number has jumped 140% in the last few years. The CDC issues crisis after crisis among Native communities regarding teen suicide. You know, for context, Mashpee Wampanoag in Massachusetts lost 15 youth in 30 days in 2016. Women are 10 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. Remember the Pokahati? Sexually assaulted or face violence than the national average, 10 times. More than 4 out of 5 Indigenous women report as being victims of violence, and 96% of them describe their attacker as non-Native. Our men meet the highest death rates from police brutality and incarceration, falling at 14 times more likely than the national average. Native American females, though, not to be outdone, are 38 times more likely to die at the hands of the police. 38 times more likely. So Native American people are killed in police encounters more than any other ethnic group, according to the CDC. And yet we make up less than 2% of the population of the US. So what a school system teaches us, what we see, those myths and stereotypes create biases that dramatically affect our outcomes. It can be really hard to visualize a future with yourself in it when you're faced with this kind of erasure and violence. There needs to be an understanding of how the rise of mascots began when Native children were removed from their homes and placed in boarding schools. Remember, I was talking about my grandfather being in a boarding school? There were 139 Indian residential schools in Canada and over 350 Indian boarding schools in the United States. Canada had a Canadian Truth and Reconciliation report on residential schools in Canada, and they claimed in Canada that 3,213 children died. That's awful. But since June of 2021, 11 school grounds in Canada and 9 in the United States, only less than 20 of these schools have been searched for unmarked graves. This time last year, there was over 7,500 children's bodies found. And at this point, currently, I should say this time last summer, that's where we were. Currently, right now, we're over 10,000. 10,000 children's bodies have been recovered out of less than 20 schools. So keeping this in mind, that when mascots were on the rise, when Native children were being put through these schools, non-Natives at that time were struggling for a common identity in this melting pot country. And they chose the Native images to honor the warrior and the fallen savage, right? Giving nod to manifest destiny and attempting to control our identity and representation. Going back to imperialist nostalgia. We are also the only race that is used for mascots, right alongside animals and chosen professions, because you can choose to be a cowboy, you can choose to be a patriot. There's also races that are not oppressed minorities, such as Vikings. Not sure they really exist anymore, but they're not oppressed, that's for sure. And imaginary beings are leprechauns. And if the Irish have a problem with it, they can do something about it. So what does mascot representation say about Native people? Does it say that we're right alongside animals and imaginary people? Also, how we're represented is as a Native woman. I found it very dangerous to be speaking up for change. See this picture? I mean, if you Google my name and mascots, you might come up with this picture. It's the press frequently portrays me as angry, but I was actually having a pleasant conversation when the press took this picture. I was saying, here is who needs to be invited to the table when you're talking about changing, the term Indians to a more acceptable mascot name. But this also makes it more dangerous for us as an oppressed minority to be speaking up, because this caused myself and other Native activists to be subject to verbal harassment and threats of harm and rape, even death. So that is really, really dangerous. I become a member of Mass Mascot Coalition and Mass Indigenous Agenda, and we have been really working hard since 2016 to be making changes. I think we're at about 28 schools have made the change in Massachusetts over the past 3 years. 4 years, and we are currently working with about 3 more schools considering change. And the schools have mentioned that they're making these changes because they want to be on the right side of history. And since we do have bills that are, it's going to be reintroduced this next session, and it's looking really good, they would rather be on the right side of history than face an inevitable mandate. I've also been very public about representation as a violation of our civil rights. And I work very closely with legislators to get a number of bills passed about representation. I also, at Okateo Cultural Center, I've curated and moderated a panel of Indigenous leaders and representatives from New England. And I included a well-respected scholar, Laurel Davis Delano, who has published studies on the decades of evidence regarding the harm that mascots inflict. That was a really fabulous piece that we did, and that was shared among the Senate. The entire Senate viewed this panel, which was a very important piece of education. But the one good thing, if you read my curator statement about the mascot controversy, is that it allows us to learn. It allows us to have these moments of education, to grow and to hear other points of view. And it enables us to have a closer inspection of how we see each other and how we treat each other as human beings. So during the debate about sports mascots and Native mascots, we always hear the same thing over and over again, that, Native people are invisible, we're only a part of history, that to use our name and images is somehow honoring this romanticized, noble savage warrior kind of look. And pro-mascot individuals basically say that if they remove the offensive imagery and mascots, the entire story of Native people in the region would be erased. Like that's how they're getting educated, is through a mascot. And somehow by having this racist mascot there, that's how they're educating the students on Indigenous people. It's sad. So the need for accurate representation grew with each passing day and each passing statement that rendered us as historical and dehumanized and caricatured, stereotypes, and invisibilizing us further from mainstream society. So I remember sitting with Linda McInerney from Egg Tooth Productions after we made the change in Turner's Falls High School. And Linda told me she would like to create a documentary movie about me and my struggles changing the mascot there. And I said, no way. I'm not comfortable centering this issue on just one person. I knew that this had to be a wider lens, to coin a phrase, that would include many Native people, particularly of this area. So my idea was to facilitate an art installation that brings to light the many people in the local Indigenous community that seemed so invisible, and make their faces and their voices and their very humanness a part of a public consciousness. And as Sara was saying, I was guided in this mission by the inspirational work of Indigenous photographers like Matika Wilbur, and Josu Rivas, and Brian Adams, who is Iñupiaq and has quite a body of work on my family. And my dog is playing with a squeaky toy. You might hear it. Their work brings agency of identity and culture and contemporary issues to the forefront. Their work challenges the dominant narrative and brings about Indigenous-led narrative change. So in that same spirit of agency over identity, I asked participants to choose a happy place that was meaningful to them and made sure that they had agency over how they chose to represent themselves through their clothing, their cultural items, their expressions. And I actually went into these spaces wearing all Black. And I learned a lot about these portraits. And even, as Sara was saying, like I even challenged what I envisioned. I had visions of libraries and video games and, 21st century trappings of our culture today. But most participants, they chose to be outside. So I came to understand, kind of what I talked about in the beginning about our identity is that most Native people still predominantly identify with the land that they come from, even if it's the land that they're just currently on, So that was a really beautiful part. The exceptional part of this exhibit is just giving the voice. I asked each person for a statement about their portrait and provided like all the space that they needed to convey their message. I did kind of mention how this project came about, but I asked each person to speak about whatever they needed to talk about, whatever they felt like needed to be lifted. So the results of these photos and their thoughts in the installation are a portrait quite clearly of a Native America right here in this area. And I wanted people to see, that we are professors and there's teachers and there's doctors and there's artists and there's council members and there's lawyers and students and grandparents and mothers and fathers and children, just all living like our daily lives right here amongst you. And so what I want to do is leave this presentation with a powerful quote from Aimé Césaire. And when I heard this quote very recently, it was actually Friday, and it has really imprinted my brain. And I want to leave this quote with you, and hopefully that will also lead you to some deep listening. And that is, art is the only weapon we have against the deafness of history. So thank you very much. That was a big share, and I hope that we have some folks that are interested. And I suppose if folks do have any questions, go ahead and email them to me, Courtney. I think it's very important that folks get involved. Check out okateo.org. We're on the web. We have an extensive, I make sure that I have resources, very extensive resources. All of our living presence. We just wrapped up our 7th one on Sunday. So we have quite a few of these panels that have an Indigenous point of view and talk about pertinent topics within our communities. So I encourage you, please, to check that out and support, indigeneity, rematriation, support, Indigenous sovereignty in this area. There's plenty of things going on around here. So, and I want to thank Sara Lyons so much for stepping up into this role. That was such an amazing time and such an incredible moment. So I really appreciate Sara's work on this. And she learned a lot. It was a crash course in Indigenous identity. And really stepped into that role. So I'm really proud of what we started. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. I just have one question about the project. Like, is there any plan to expand or continue What would it take for that to happen?
Oh gosh, right. So we exhibited in we opened the exhibit in May of 2019, and we had plans to other folks, because it was a really limited time. I think we had 4 or 6 weeks. It was not a lot of time to do this. So we had a lot of folks that wanted to have their portraits done, and we had a number of folks in queue, and COVID happened.
Yeah.
And so since then we haven't picked up, and I don't know what plans are, because I would love to pick up again. I would love to do some more. I think it's an important piece. We do have other Native photographer in the area, that's Scott Foster, who's also putting together quite a body of portraits, Indigenous portraits. And Anthony Melting-Tallow also, he does some photography, although his exhibit recently was on mixed media arts at the Wisteria Hearst Museum in Holyoke. Absolutely stunning display of artwork. But there's plenty of, folks that, are doing very similar pieces of work. I would love to continue though. I would, but that's also up to Sara and her busy life, and I am super busy. So
Yeah. Well, thank you both again for joining us tonight. Does Sara have any last comments? Not to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, just appreciation all around for sharing the work, and I am grateful for the opportunity. I do think I would love to see. I think that I was the person in the moment, because I think that Rhonda's vision needed to happen, and I'm so grateful for the crash course and everything that I learned and all the folks that I met. I would love to pass the photography role on to an Indigenous photographer, as I think it's super important for the narrative to be Indigenous led all around. While I still think there's room for folks who are willing to do the work and be strong allies to collaborate and to make work. Yeah, so I lost my train of thought there, but yeah, I just I think we are at a very unique time in history where there's just doors opening and the right people are getting connected, and it's so exciting to see. I really do, with such an open heart and such enthusiasm, love to see these projects evolving, and really see a medium that I love, being utilized for good, and for just being more expansive. So that piece is really exciting. So
thank you.
And I'm glad to have played a part for my community, and to have had this opportunity to collaborate with Rhonda. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you both for sharing your art and your vision and all of this education and all of these other artists that I will try to list on our website and share around for everyone to check out. So I think that's a good place to end for the evening. But thank you so much. And the exhibit is up until the 27th, so everyone should come check it out.
Yeah, sounds good.
Everybody have a great night.
Thanks.
You take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.